Hi everyone, this is Robert. Welcome to The Well-Told Tale. Every week we bring you the finest science fiction and fantasy stories ever written. We have reached part 12 of The First Men in the Moon by H.G. Wells, our penultimate episode. Mr Bedford has managed to return to Earth, leaving Mr Cavor behind, but now a Dutch scientist, Mr Wendigee, claims to have received some communications from him. What could Mr Cavor be trying to communicate from the moon? It's time to pull up a chair, relax, and enjoy part 12 of The First Men in the Moon by H.G. Wells. 23. An abstract of the 6 messages first received from Mr. Cavor. The 2 earlier messages of Mr. Cavor may very well be reserved for that larger volume. They simply tell, with greater brevity and with a difference in several details that is interesting but not of any vital importance, the bare facts of the making of the sphere and our departure from the world. Throughout, Cavor speaks of me as a man who is dead, but with a curious change of temper as he approaches our landing on the moon. Poor Bedford, he says of me, and this poor young man, and he blames himself for inducing a young man, by no means well equipped for such adventures, to leave a planet on which he was indisputably fitted to succeed on so precarious a mission. I think he underrates the part my energy and practical capacity played in bringing about the realization of his theoretical sphere. We arrived, he says, with no more account of our passage than if we had made a journey of common occurrence in a railway train. And then he becomes increasingly unfair to me. Unfair indeed, to an extent I should not have expected in a man trained in the search for truth. Looking back over my previously written account of these things, I must insist that I have been altogether juster to Cavor than he has been to me. I have extenuated little and suppressed nothing, but his account is... It speedily became apparent that the entire strangeness of our circumstances and surroundings, great loss of weight, attenuated but highly oxygenated air, consequent exaggeration of the results of muscular effort, rapid development of weird plants from obscure spores, lurid sky, was exciting my companion unduly. On the moon, his character seemed to deteriorate. He became impulsive, rash, and quarrelsome. In a little while, his folly in devouring some gigantic vesicles and his consequent intoxication led to our capture by the Selenites, before we had the slightest opportunity of properly observing their ways. He says you observed nothing of his own concession to these same vesicles. And he goes on from that point to say that we came to a difficult passage with them, and Bedford, mistaking certain gestures of theirs, pretty gestures they were, gave way to a panic violence. He ran amok, killing 3, and perforce I had to flee with him after the outrage. Subsequently, we fought with a number who endeavoured to bar our way, and slew 7 or 8 more. It says much for the tolerance of these beings that on my recapture I was not instantly slain. We made our way to the exterior and separated in the crater of our arrival to increase our chances of recovering the sphere. But presently I came upon a body of Selenites, led by 2 who were curiously different, even in form, from any of those we had seen hitherto, with larger heads and smaller bodies, and much more elaborately wrapped about. And after evading them for some time, I fell into a crevasse, cut my head rather badly, and displaced my patella, and, finding crawling very painful, decided to surrender, if they would still permit me to do so. This they did, and perceiving my helpless condition, carried me with them again into the moon. And of Bedford, I have heard or seen nothing more, nor, so far as I can gather, has any Selenite. Either the night overtook him in the crater, or else, which is more probable, he found the sphere, and desiring to steal a march upon me, made off with it. Only I fear to find it uncontrollable, and to meet a more lingering fate in outer space. And with that, Cavor dismisses me, and goes on to more interesting topics. I dislike the idea of seeming to use my position as his editor to deflect his story in my own interest, but I am obliged to protest here against the turn he gives these occurrences. He said nothing about that gasping message on the blood-stained paper in which he told, or attempted to tell, a very different story. The dignified self-surrender is an altogether new view of the affair that has come to him, I must insist, since he began to feel secure among the lunar people. And as for the stealing a march conception, I am quite willing to let the reader decide between us on what he has before him. I know I am not a model man. I may have no pretence to be. But am I that? However, that is the sum of my wrongs. From this point, I can edit Cavor with an untroubled mind, for he mentions me no more. It would seem the Selenites who had come upon him carried him to some point in the interior down a great shaft, by means of what he describes as a sort of balloon. We gather from the rather confused passage in which he describes this, and from a number of chance allusions and hints in other and subsequent messages, that this great shaft is one of an enormous system of artificial shafts that run, each from what is called a lunar crater, downwards for at least nearly 100 miles towards the central portion of our satellite. These shafts communicate by transverse tunnels. They throw out abysmal caverns and expand into great globular places. The whole of the moon's substance, for 100 miles inward indeed, is a mere sponge of rock. Partly, says Cavor, this sponginess is natural, but very largely it is due to the enormous industry of the Selenites in the past. The enormous circular mounds of the excavated rock and earth it is that form those great circles about the tunnels known to earthly astronomers, misled by a false analogy, as volcanoes. It was down this shaft they took him, in this sort of balloon he speaks of, at first into an inky blackness, and then into a region of continually increasing phosphorescence. Cavor's dispatches show him to be curiously regardless of detail for a scientific man, but we gather that this light was due to the streams and cascades of water, no doubt containing some phosphorescent organism that flowed ever more abundantly downward towards the central sea, and as he descended, he says, the Selenites also became luminous. And at last, far below him, he saw, as it were, a lake of heatless fire, the waters of the central sea, glowing and eddying in strange perturbation, like luminous blue milk that is just on the boil. This lunar sea, says Cavor in a later passage, is not a stagnant ocean. A solar tide sends it in a perpetual flow around the lunar axis, and strange storms and boilings and rushings of its waters occur, and at times cold winds and thunderings that ascend out of it into the busy ways of the great ant-hill above. It is only when the water is in motion that it gives out light. In its rare seasons of calm, it is black. Commonly, when one sees it, its waters rise and fall in an oily swell, and flakes and big rafts of shining bubbly foam drift with the sluggish, faintly glowing current. The Selenites navigate its cavernous straits and lagoons in little shallow boats of a canoe-like shape, and even before my journey to the galleries about the Grand Lunar, who is master of the moon, I was permitted to make a brief excursion on its waters. The caverns and passages are naturally very tortuous. A large proportion of these ways are known only to expert pilots among the fishermen, and not infrequently Selenites are lost forever in their labyrinths. In their remoter recesses, I am told, strange creatures lurk, some of them terrible and dangerous creatures that all the science of the moon has been unable to exterminate. There is particularly the Rapha, an inextricable mass of clutching tentacles that one hacks to pieces only to multiply, and the Tsi, a darting creature that is never seen, so subtly and suddenly does it slay. He gives us a gleam of description. I was reminded on this excursion of what I have read of the Mammoth Caves, if only I had a yellow flambeau instead of the pervading blue light, and a solid-looking boatman with an oar instead of a scuttle-faced Selenite working an engine at the back of the canoe. I could have imagined I had suddenly got back to Earth. The rocks about us were very various, sometimes black, sometimes pale blue and veined, and once they flashed and glittered as though we had come into a mine of sapphires. And below, one saw the ghostly phosphorescent fishes flash and vanish in the hardly less phosphorescent deep. Then, presently, a long ultramarine vista down the turgid stream of one of the channels of traffic, and a landing stage, and then perhaps a glimpse up the enormous crowded shaft of one of the vertical ways. In one great place, heavy with glistening stalactites, a number of boats were fishing. We went alongside one of these and watched the long-armed selenites winding in a net. They were little hunchbacked insects with very strong arms, short, bandy legs and crinkled face masks. As they pulled at it, that net seemed the heaviest thing I've come upon in the moon. It was loaded with weights, no doubt of gold, and it took a long time to draw, for in those waters the larger and more edible fish lurk deep. The fish in the net came up like a blue moonrise, a blaze of darting, tossing blue. Among their catch was a many-tentaculate, evil-eyed black thing, ferociously active, whose appearance they greeted with shrieks and twitters, and which, with quick, nervous movements, they hacked to pieces by means of little hatchets. All its deserved limbs continued to lash and writhe in a vicious manner. Afterwards, when fever had hold of me, I dreamt again and again of that bitter, furious creature rising so vigorous and active out of the unknown sea. It was the most active and malignant thing of all the living creatures I have yet seen in this world inside the moon. The surface of this sea must be very nearly 200 miles, if not more, below the level of the moon's exterior. All the cities of the moon lie, I learnt, immediately above this central sea, in such cavernous spaces and artificial galleries as I have described, and they communicate with the exterior by enormous vertical shafts which open invariably in what are called by earthly astronomers the craters of the moon. The lid covering one such aperture I had already seen during the wanderings that had preceded my capture. Upon the condition of the less central portion of the moon, I have not yet arrived at very precise knowledge. There is an enormous system of caverns in which the moon carves shelter during the night, and there are abattoirs and the like. In one of these it was that I and Bedford fought with the selenite butchers, and I have since seen balloons laden with meat descending out of the upper dark. I have as yet scarcely learnt as much of these things as a Zulu in London would learn about the British corn supplies in the same time. It is clear, however, that these vertical shafts and the vegetation of the surface must play an essential role in ventilating and keeping fresh the atmosphere of the moon. At one time, and particularly on my first emergence from my prison, there was certainly a cold wind blowing down the shaft, and later there was a kind of sirocco upwards that corresponded with my fever. For at the end of about 3 weeks I fell ill of an indefinable sort of fever, and in spite of sleep and the quinine tabloids that very fortunately I had brought in my pocket, I remained ill and fretting miserably, almost to the time when I was taken into the presence of the Grand Lunar, who is the master of the moon. I will not dilate on the wretchedness of my condition, he remarks, during those days of ill health, and here he goes on with great amplitude with details I omit here. My temperature, he concludes, kept abnormally high for a long time, and I lost all desire for food. I had stagnant waking intervals and sleep tormented by dreams, and at one phase I was, I remember, so weak as to be earth-sick and almost hysterical. I longed almost intolerably for colour to break the everlasting blue. He reverts again presently to the topic of this sponge-caught lunar atmosphere. I am told by astronomers and physicists that all he tells is in absolute accordance with what was already known of the moon's condition. Had earthly astronomers had the courage and imagination to push home a bold induction, says Mr Wendigee, they might have foretold almost everything that Cavor has to say of the general structure of the moon. They know now pretty certainly that Moon and Earth are not so much satellite and primary as smaller and greater sisters made out of one mass and consequently made of the same material. And since the density of the Moon is only 3/5 that of the Earth, there can be nothing for it but that she is hollowed out by a great system of caverns. There was no necessity, said Sir Japes Flap, F.R.S., that most entertaining exponent of the facetious side of the stars, that we should ever have gone to the moon to find out such easy inferences. and points the pun with an allusion to Gruyere, but he certainly might have announced his knowledge of the hollowness of the moon before. And if the moon is hollow, then the apparent absence of air and water is, of course, quite easily explained. The sea lies within, at the bottom of the caverns, and the air travels through the great sponge of galleries in accordance with simple physical laws. The caverns of the moon, on the whole, are very windy places. As the sunlight comes round the moon, the air in the outer galleries on that side is heated, its pressure increases, some flows out on the exterior and mingles with the evaporating air of the craters, where the plants remove its carbonic acid, while the greater portion flows round through the galleries to replace the shrinking air of the cooling side that the sunlight has left. There is, therefore, a constant eastward breeze in the air of the outer galleries, and an upflow during the lunar day up the shafts, complicated, of course, very greatly by the varying shape of the galleries and the ingenious contrivances of the Selenite mind. 24. The Natural History of the Selenites. The messages of Cavor from the 6th up to the 16th are, for the most part, so much broken, and they abound in so much repetitions, that they scarcely form a consecutive narrative. They will be given in full, of course, in the scientific report, but here it will be far more convenient to continue simply to abstract and quote, as in the former chapter. We have subjected every word to a keen critical scrutiny, and my own brief memories and impressions of lunar things have been of inestimable help in interpreting what would have otherwise been impenetrably dark. And naturally, as living beings, our interest centres far more upon the strange community of lunar insects in which he was living, it would seem, as an honoured guest, than upon the mere physical condition of their world. I have already made it clear, I think, that the Selenites I saw resembled man in maintaining the erect attitude and in having 4 limbs, and I have compared the general appearance of their head and the jointing of their limbs to that of insects. I have mentioned, too, the peculiar consequence of the small gravitation of the moon on their fragile slightness. Cavor confirms me upon all these points. He calls them animals, though of course they fall under no division in the classification of earthly creatures, and he points out the insect type of anatomy had, fortunately for men, never exceeded a relatively very small size on Earth. The largest terrestrial insects, living or extinct, do not, as a matter of fact, measure 6 inches in length. But here, against the lesser gravitation of the moon, a creature certainly as much an insect as vertebrate seems to have been able to attain to human and ultra-human dimensions. He does not mention the ant, but throughout his allusions the ant is continually being brought before my mind in its sleepless activity, in its intelligence and social organisation, in its structure, and more particularly in the fact that it displays, in addition to the 2 forms, the male and the female form that almost all other animals possess, a number of other sexless creatures, workers, soldiers and the like, differing from one another in structure, character, power and use, and yet all members of the same species. For these Selenites also have a great variety of forms. Of course, they are not only colossally greater in size than ants, but also, in Cavor's opinion at least, in intelligence, morality and social wisdom are they colossally greater than man. And instead of the 4 or 5 different forms of ant that are found, there are almost innumerably different forms of Selenite. I had endeavoured to indicate the very considerable difference observable in such Selenites of the outer crust as I happened to encounter. The differences in size and proportions were certainly as wide as the differences between the most widely separated races of men, but such differences, as I saw, fade to absolutely nothing in comparison with the huge distinctions of which Cavor tells. It would seem the exterior Selenites I saw were, indeed, mostly engaged in kindred occupations, mooncalf herds, butchers, fleshers, and the like. But within the moon, practically unsuspected by me, there are, it seems, a number of other sorts of Selenite, differing in size, differing in the relative strength of part to part, differing in power and appearance, and yet not different species of creatures, but only different forms of one species, and retaining through all their variations a certain common likeness that marks their specific unity. The moon is, indeed, a sort of vast ant-hill, only instead of there being only 4 or 5 sorts of ant, there are many hundred different sorts of selenite, and almost every gradation between one sort and another. It would seem the discovery came upon Cavor very speedily. I infer, rather than learn from his narrative, that he was captured by the mooncalf herds under the direction of these other Selenites who have larger brain cases, heads, and very much shorter legs. Finding he would not walk even under the goad, they carried him into darkness, crossed a narrow plank-like bridge that must have been the identical bridge I had refused, and put him down in something that must have seemed at first to be some sort of lift. This was the balloon. It had certainly been absolutely invisible to us in the darkness, and what had seemed to me a mere plank walking into the void was really, no doubt, the passage of the gangway. In this he descended towards constantly more luminous caverns of the moon. At first they descended in silence, save for the twitterings of the Selenites, and then into a stir of windy movement. In a little while, the profound blackness had made his eyes so sensitive that he began to see more and more of the things around him, and at last the vague took shape. Conceive an enormous cylindrical space, says Cavor in his 7th message, a quarter of a mile across, perhaps, very dimly lit at first and then brighter, with big platforms twisting down its sides in a spiral that vanishes at last below in a blue profundity, and lit even more brightly. One could not tell how or why. Think of the well of the very largest spiral staircase or lift shaft that you have ever looked down, and magnify that by 100. Imagine it at twilight, seen through blue glass. Imagine yourself looking down that. Only imagine also that you feel extraordinarily light and have got rid of any giddy feeling you might have on earth, and you will have the first conditions of my impression. Round this enormous shaft, imagine a broad gallery running in a much steeper spiral than would be credible on Earth, and forming a steep road protected from the gulf only by a little parapet that vanishes at last in perspective a couple of miles below. Looking up, I saw the very fellow of the downward vision. It had, of course, the effect of looking into a very steep cone. A wind was blowing down the shaft, and far above I fancy I heard, growing fainter and fainter, the bellowing of the mooncalves that were being driven down again from their evening pasturage on the exterior. And up and down the spiral galleries were scattered numerous moon people, pallid, faintly luminous beings, regarding our appearance or busied on unknown errands. Either I fancied it, or a flake of snow came drifting down on the icy breeze, and then, falling like a snowflake, a little figure, a little man-insect, clinging to a parachute, drove down very swiftly towards the central places of the moon. The big-headed Selenite sitting beside me, seeing me move my head with the gesture of one who saw, pointed his trunk-like hand and indicated a sort of jetty coming into sight very far below, a little landing stage, as it were, hanging into the void. As it swept up towards us, our pace diminished very rapidly, and in a few moments, as it seemed, we were abreast of it, and at rest. A mooring rope was flung and grasped, and I found myself pulled down to a level with the great crowd of Selenites who jostled to see me. It was an incredible crowd. Suddenly and violently there was forced upon my attention the vast amount of difference there is amongst these beings of the moon. Indeed, there seemed not two alike in all that jostling multitude. They differed in shape, they differed in size, they rang all the horrible changes on the theme of Selenite form. Some bulged and overhung, some ran about among the feet of their fellows. All of them had a grotesque and disquieting suggestion of an insect that had somehow contrived to mock humanity. But all seemed to present an incredible exaggeration of some particular feature. One had a vast right forelimb, an enormous antennal arm, as it were. One seemed all leg, poised as it were on stilts. Another protruded the edge of his face mask into a nose-like organ that made him startlingly human until one saw his expressionless, gaping mouth. The strange and, except for the want of mandibles and palps, most insect-like head of the mooncalf minders underwent, indeed, the most incredible transformations. Here it was broad and low, here high and narrow. Here its leathery brow was drawn out into horns and strange features. Here it was whiskered and divided, and there with a grotesquely human profile. One distortion was particularly conspicuous. There were several brain cases distended like bladders to a huge size, with the face mask reduced to quite small proportions. There were several amazing forms, with heads reduced to microscopic proportions and blobby bodies, and fantastic flimsy things that existed, it would seem, only as a basis for vast trumpet-like protrusions of the lower part of the mask. And oddest of all, as it seemed to me for the moment, 2 or 3 of these weird inhabitants of a subterranean world, a world sheltered by innumerable miles of rock from sun or rain, carried umbrellas in their tentaculate hands, real terrestrial-looking umbrellas. And then I thought of the parachutist I had watched descend. These moon people behaved exactly as a human crowd might have done in similar circumstances. They jostled and thrust one another. They shoved one another aside. They even clambered upon one another to get a glimpse of me. Every moment they increased in numbers and pressed more urgently upon the discs of my ushers. And Cavor does not explain what he means by this. Every moment fresh shapes emerged from the shadows and forced themselves upon my astounded attention. And presently I was signed and helped into a sort of litter and lifted up on the shoulders of strong-armed bearers, and so borne through the twilight over the seething multitude towards the apartments that were provided for me in the moon. All about me were eyes, faces, masks, a leathery noise like the rustling of beetle wings, and a great bleating and cricket-like twittering of selenite voices. We gather he was taken to a hexagonal apartment, and there for a space he was confined. Afterwards he was given a much more considerable liberty, indeed almost as much freedom as one has in a civilized town on earth. And it would appear that the mysterious being who is the ruler and master of the moon appointed 2 Selenites with large heads to guard and study him, and to establish whatever mental communications were possible with him. And amazing and incredible as it may seem, these 2 creatures, these fantastic men-insects, these beings of other worlds, were presently communicating with Cavor by means of terrestrial speech. Cavor speaks of them as Phi-Oo and Psi-Puff. Phi-Oo, he says, was about 5 feet high. He had small, slender legs about 18 inches long, and slight feet of the common lunar pattern. On these balanced a little body, throbbing with the pulsations of his heart. He had long, soft, many-jointed arms ending in a tentacled grip, and his neck was many-jointed in the usual way, but exceptionally short and thick. His head, says Cavor, apparently alluding to some previous description that has gone astray in space, is of the common lunar type, but strangely modified. The mouth has the usual expressionless gape, but it is unusually small and pointing downward, and the mask is reduced to the size of a large, flat nose flap. On either side are the little eyes. The rest of the head is distended into a huge globe, and the chitinous leathery cuticle of the mooncalf herds thins out to a mere membrane, through which the pulsating brain movements are distinctly visible. He is a creature, indeed, with a tremendously hypertrophied brain, and with the rest of his organism both relatively and absolutely dwarfed. In another passage, Cavor compares the back view of him to Atlas supporting the world. Psi-Puff, it seems, was a very similar insect, but his face was drawn out to a considerable length, and the bane hypertrophy being in different regions. His head was not round, but pear-shaped, with the stalk downward. There were also litter carriers, lopsided beings with enormous shoulders, very spidery ushers, and a squat foot attendant in Cavor's retinue. The matter in which Phi-Oo and Psi-Puff attacked the problem of speech was fairly obvious. They came into this hexagonal cell in which Cavor was confined, and began imitating every sound he made, beginning with a cough. He seems to have grasped their intention with great quickness, and to have begun repeating words to them and pointing to indicate the application. The procedure was probably always the same. Phi-Oo would attend to Cavor for a space, then point also and say the word he had heard. The first word he mastered was man, and the second moony, which Cavor on the spur of the moment seems to have used instead of selenite for the moon race. As soon as Phi-Oo was assured of the meaning of a word, he repeated it to Psi-Puff, who remembered it infallibly. They mastered over 100 English nouns in their first session. Subsequently, it seems they brought an artist with them to assist the work of explanations with sketches and diagrams, Cavor's drawings being rather crude. He was, says Cavor, a being with an active arm and an arresting eye, and he seemed to draw with incredible swiftness. The 11th message is undoubtedly only a fragment of a longer communication. After some broken sentences, the record of which is unintelligible, it goes on. But it will interest only linguists and delay me too long to give the details of the series of intent parleys of which these were the beginning, and indeed, I very much doubt if I could give in anything like the proper order all the twistings and turnings that we made in our pursuit of mutual comprehension. Verbs were soon plain sailing, at least such active verbs as I could express by drawings. Some adjectives were easy, but when it came to abstract nouns, to prepositions, and the sort of hackneyed figures of speech by means of which so much is expressed on earth, it was like diving in cork jackets. Indeed, these difficulties were insurmountable until to the 6th lesson came a 4th assistant, a being with a huge football-shaped head, whose forte was clearly the pursuit of intricate analogy. He entered in a preoccupied manner, stumbled against the stool, and the difficulties that arose had to be presented to him with a certain amount of clamour and hitting and pricking before they reached his comprehension. But once he was involved, his penetration was amazing. Whenever there came a need of thinking beyond Phi Oo's by no means limited scope, this prolate-headed person was in request, but he invariably told the conclusion to Tsai Puff, in order that it might be remembered. Tsai Puff was ever the arsenal for facts, and so we advanced again. It seemed long and yet brief, a matter of days, before I was positively talking with these insects of the moon. Of course, at first it was an intercourse infinitely tedious and exasperating, but imperceptibly it has grown to comprehension, and my patience has grown to meet its limitations. Phi Oo it is who does all of the talking. He does it with a vast amount of meditative provisional and has caught up one or two phrases, if I may say, if you understand, and beads all his speech with them. Thus he would discourse. Imagine him explaining his artist. He, if I may say, draw, eat little, drink little, draw, love draw, no other thing, hate all who not draw like him, angry, hate all who draw like him better, hate most people, hate all who not, who think all world for to draw, angry, all things mean nothing to him, only draw, he like you, if you understand, new thing to draw, ugly, striking, eh? He, turning to Tsai Puff, love remember words, remember wonderful more than any, think no, draw no, remember, say. Here he referred to his gifted assistant for a word. Histories, all things, he hear once, say ever. It is more wonderful to me than I dreamt that anything ever could be again, to hear in this perpetual obscurity these extraordinary creatures, for even familiarity fails to weaken the inhuman effects of their appearance, continually piping a nearer approach to coherent earthly speech, asking questions, giving answers. I feel that I am casting back to the fable-hearing period of childhood again, when the ant and the grasshopper talked together and the bee judged between them. And while these linguistic exercises were going on, Cavor seems to have experienced a considerable relaxation of his confinement. The first dread and distrust our unfortunate conflict aroused is being, he said, continually effaced by the deliberate rationality of all I do. I am now able to come and go as I please, or I am restricted only for my own good. So it is I have been able to get at this apparatus, and assisted by a happy find among the material that is littered in this enormous store cave, I have contrived to dispatch these messages. So far, not the slightest attempt has been made to interfere with me in this, although I have made it quite clear to Phi Oo that I am signalling to the earth. You talk to other? He asked, watching me. Others, said I. Others? He said. Oh yes, men? And I went on transmitting. Cavor was continually making corrections in his previous accounts of the Selenites as fresh facts flowed upon him to modify his conclusions, and accordingly one gives the quotations that follow with a certain amount of reservation. They are quoted from the 9th, 13th and 16th messages, And altogether vague and fragmentary as they are, they probably give us as complete a picture of the social life of this strange community as mankind can now hope to have for many generations. In the Moon, says Cavor, every citizen knows his place. He is born to that place, and the elaborate discipline of training in education and surgery he undergoes fits him at last so completely to it that he has neither ideas nor organs for any purpose beyond it. Why should he? Fai-U would ask. If, for example, a Selenite is destined to be a mathematician, his teachers and trainers set out at once to that end. They check any incipient disposition to other pursuits, they encourage his mathematical bias with a perfect psychological skill, his brain grows, or at least the mathematical faculties of his brain grow, and the rest of him only so much as is necessary to sustain this essential part of him. At last, save for rest and food, his one delight lies in the exercise and display of his faculty, his one interest in its application, his sole society with other specialists in his own line. His brain grows continually larger, at least so far as the portions engaging in mathematics are concerned. They bulge ever larger and seem to suck all life and vigour from the rest of his frame. His limbs shrivel, his heart and digestive organs diminish, his insect face is hidden under its bulging contours, his voice becomes mere stridulation for the stating of formulae. He seems deaf to all but properly enunciated problems. The faculty of laughter, save for the sudden discovery of some paradox, is lost to him. His deepest emotion is the evolution of a novel computation, and so he attains his end. Or, again, a Selenite appointed to be a minder of mooncalves is from his earliest days induced to think and live mooncalf, to find his pleasure in mooncalf lore, his exercise in their tending or pursuit. He is trained to become wiry and active. His eye is indurated to the tight wrappings, the angular contours that constitute a smart mooncalfishness. He takes at last no interest in the deeper parts of the moon. He regards all Selenites not equally versed in mooncalves with indifference, derision, or hostility. His thoughts are of mooncalf pastures, and his dialect an accomplished mooncalf technique. So also he loves his work and discharges in perfect happiness the duty that justifies his being. And so it is with all sorts and conditions of Selenites. Each is a perfect unit in a world machine. These beings with their big heads on whom the intellectual labours fall form a sort of aristocracy in this strange society, and the head of them, quintessential of the moon, is that marvellous gigantic ganglion, the grand lunar, into whose presence I am finally to come. The unlimited development of the minds of the intellectual class is rendered possible by the absence of any bony skull in the lunar anatomy, that strange box of bone that clamps about the developing brain of man, imperiously insisting thus far and no further to all his possibilities. They fall into three main classes, differing greatly in influence and respect. There are administrators, of whom Fai-U is one, Selenites of considerable initiative and versatility, responsible each for a certain cubic content of the moon's bulk. The experts, like the football-headed thinker, who are trained to perform certain special operations, and the erudite, who are the repositories of all knowledge. To the latter class belongs Tsai Puff, the first lunar professor of terrestrial languages. With regard to these latter, it is a curious little thing to note that the unlimited growth of the lunar brain has rendered unnecessary the invention of all these mechanical aids to brainwork which have distinguished the career of man. There are no books, no records of any kind, no libraries or inscriptions. All knowledge is stored in distended brains, much as the honey ants of Texas store honey in their distended abdomens. The Lunar Somerset House and the Lunar British Museum Library are collections of living brains. The less specialised administrators, I note, for the most part, take a very lively interest in me whenever they encounter me. They will come out of the way and stare at me and ask questions to which Fai-U will reply. I see them going hither and thither with a retinue of bearers, attendants, shouters, parachute carriers, and so forth. Queer groups to see. The experts, for the most part, ignore me completely, even as they ignore each other, or notice me only to begin a clamorous exhibition of their distinctive skill. The erudite, for the most part, are wrapped in an impervious and apoplectic complacency, from which only a denial of their erudition can rouse them. Usually they are led about by little watchers and attendants, and often there are small and active-looking creatures, small females usually, that I am inclined to think are a sort of wife to them. But some of the profounder scholars are altogether too great for locomotion, and are carried from place to place in a sort of sedan tub, wobbling jellies of knowledge that enlist my respectful astonishment. I have just passed one in coming to this place, where I am permitted to amuse myself with these electrical toys. A vast, shaven, shaky head, bald and thin-skinned, carried on his grotesque stretcher. In front and behind come his bearers, and curious, almost trumpet-faced news disseminators shrieked his fame. I have already mentioned the retinues that accompany most of the intellectuals, ushers, bearers, valets, extraneous tentacles and muscles, as it were, to replace the abortive physical powers of these hypertrophied minds. Porters almost invariably accompany them. There are also extremely swift messengers with spider-like legs and hands for grasping parachutes, and attendants with vocal organs that could well nigh wake the dead. Apart from their controlling intelligence, these subordinates are as inert and helpless as umbrellas in a stand. They exist only in relation to the orders they have to obey, the duties they have to perform. The bulk of these insects, however, who go to and fro upon the spiral ways to fill the ascending balloons and drop past me clinging to flimsy parachutes, are, I gather, of the operative class, machine hands. Indeed, in some of these are in actual nature. It is no figure of speech. The single tentacle of the mooncalf herd is profoundly modified for clawing, lifting, guiding. The rest of them no more than necessary subordinate appendages to these important parts. Some, who I suppose deal with bell-striking mechanisms, have enormously developed auditory organs. Some whose work lies in delicate chemical operations project a vast olfactory organ. And others, who I have been told are glassblowers, seem mere lung bellows. But every one of these common selenites I have seen at work is exquisitely adapted to the social need it meets. Fine work is done by fined-down workers, amazingly dwarfed and neat. Some I could hold on the palm of my hand. There is even a sort of turnspit selenite, very common, whose duty and only delight it is to apply the motive power for various small appliances. And to rule over these things and order any erring tendency there might be in some aberrant natures are the most muscular beings I have ever seen in the moon, a sort of lunar police who must have been trained from their earliest years to give a perfect respect and obedience to the swollen heads. The making of these various sorts of operative must be a very curious and interesting process. I'm very much in the dark about it, but quite recently I came upon a number of young selenites confined in jars, from which only the forelimbs protruded, who were being compressed to become machine-minders of a special sort. The extended hand in this highly developed system of technical education is stimulated by irritants and nourished by injection, while the rest of the body is starved. Fai U, unless I misunderstand him, explained that in the earlier stages these queer little creatures are apt to display signs of suffering in their various cramped situations, but they easily become indurated to their lot, and he took me on to where a number of flexible-minded messengers were being drawn out and broken in. It is quite unreasonable, I know, but such glimpses of the educational methods of these beings affect me disagreeably. I hope, however, that may pass off, and I may be able to see more of this aspect of their wonderful social order. That wretched-looking hand tentacle sticking out of its jar seemed to have a sort of limp appeal for lost possibilities. It haunts me still, although, of course, it is really, in the end, a far more humane proceeding than our earthly method of leaving children to grow into human beings and then making machines of them. Quite recently, too, I think it was on the 11th or 12th visit I made to this apparatus, I had a curious light upon the lives of these operatives. I was being guided through a shortcut hither, instead of going down the spiral, and by the keys to the central sea. From the devious windings of a long, dark gallery, we emerged into a vast, low cavern, pervaded by an earthy smell, and, as things go in this darkness, rather brightly lit. The light came from a tumultuous growth of livid fungoid shapes, some indeed singularly like our terrestrial mushrooms, but standing as high or higher than a man. "Moonies eat these?" I said to Fai U. "Yes, food." "Goodness me," I cried. "What's that?" My eye had just caught the figure of an exceptionally big and ungainly selenite lying motionless among the stems, face downwards. We stopped. "Dead?" I asked, for as yet I'd seen no dead in the moon, and I've grown curious. "No," exclaimed Fai-oo. "Him worker. No work to do. Get little drink then, make sleep, till we want him. What good wake, huh? Not want him walking about." "There's another," cried I. And indeed, all that huge extent of mushroom ground was, I found, peppered with these prostrate figures sleeping under an opiate until the moon had need of them. There were scores of them, of all sorts, and we were able to turn over some of them and examine them more precisely than I had been able to previously. They breathed noisily at my doing so, but did not wake. One I remember very distinctly. He left a strong impression, I think, because some trick of the light and his attitude was strongly suggestive of a drawn-up human figure. His forelimbs were long, delicate tentacles. He was some kind of refined manipulator, and the pose of his slumber suggested a submissive suffering. No doubt it was a mistake for me to interpret his expression in that way, but I did. And as Fai-oo rolled him over into the darkness among the living fleshiness again, I felt a distinctly unpleasant sensation, although as he rolled, the insect in him was confessed. It simply illustrates the unthinking way in which one acquires habits of feeling. To drug the worker one does not want and toss him aside is surely far better than to expel him from his factory to wander starving in the streets. In every complicated societal community, there is necessarily a certain intermittency of employment for all specialised labour, and in this way the trouble of an unemployed problem is altogether anticipated. And yet, so unreasonable are even scientifically trained minds, I still do not like the memory of those prostrate forms amidst those quiet, luminous arcades of fleshy growth, and I avoid that shortcut in spite of the inconveniences of the longer, more noisy and more crowded alternative. My alternative route takes me round by a huge shadowy cavern, very crowded and clamorous, and here it is I see peering out of the hexagonal openings of a sort of honeycomb wall, or parading a large open space behind, or selecting the toys and amulets made to please them by the dainty tentacled jewellers who work in kennels below, the mothers of the moon world, the queen bees, as it were, of the hive. They are noble-looking beings, fantastically and sometimes quite beautifully adorned, with a proud carriage and, save for their mouths, almost microscopic heads. Of the condition of the moon sexes, marrying and giving in marriage and of birth and so forth among the Selenites, I have as yet been able to learn very little. With the steady progress of Fai-oo in English, however, my ignorance will no doubt as steadily disappear. I am of opinion that, as with the ants and bees, there is a large majority of the members of this community of the neuter sex. Of course, on Earth in our cities, there are now many who never live that life of parentage which is the natural life of man. Here, as with the ants, this thing has become a normal condition of the race, and the whole of such replacement as is necessary falls upon this special and by no means numerous class of matrons, the mothers of the moon world, large and stately beings beautifully fitted to bear the larval selenite. Unless I misunderstand an explanation of Fai-oo's, they are absolutely incapable of cherishing the young they bring into the moon. Periods of foolish indulgence alternate with moods of aggressive violence, and as soon as possible the little creatures, who are quite soft and flabby and pale-coloured, are transferred to the charge of celibate females, women workers as it were, who in some cases possess brains of almost masculine proportions. Just at this point, unhappily, this message broke off. Fragmentary and tantalising as the matter constituting this chapter is, it does nevertheless give a vague, broad impression of an altogether strange and wonderful world. A world with which our own may have to reckon we know not how speedily. This intermittent trickle of messages, this whispering of a record needle in the stillness of the mountain slopes, is the first warning of such change in human conditions as mankind has scarcely imagined heretofore. In that satellite of ours, there are new elements, new appliances, traditions, an overwhelming avalanche of new ideas, a strange race with whom we must inevitably struggle for mastery, gold as common as iron or wood. And welcome back. I hope you enjoyed part 12 of The First Men in the Moon. If you'd like to support The Well-Told Tale as we make these classics available for free to everyone, thank you. The best way to do that is through my Patreon page. There's a link in the description. I'll be back next week with the finale of the story. I hope you can join me.